I'm going to be talking about the recent events that have been taking place in the US regarding violence and anger, and see if we can actually incorporate some Buddhist perspective on it, as well as discussing some science to back it up. So,
Good.
Well, this is a topic that could easily take several days to discuss, if not hours. However, I'm going to try to squeeze it into the time allotted. In the Dhammapada, verses 3 to 6, we come through, we come across the words of the Buddha where he says, "He abused me, he beat me, he defeated me, he robbed me. The enmity of those who harbor such thoughts is not appeased. He abused me, he beat me, he defeated me, he robbed me. The enmity of those who do not harbor such thoughts is appeased. Enmities or hatred never cease by enmity in this world. Only by non-enmity, in fact, loving kindness, do they cease. This is an ancient law. And others do not know that we come to an end here, but those who know, thereby their quarrels are allayed." There's so many examples within the Tripitaka, within the Nikayas, where the Buddha uses so many stories from this world as well as from other realms, where he talks about how there have been always wars waged between different beings, just from this mere act of exchanging a few words. But I want to trace it back to how words get started. Basically, the conversation that goes on between our ears. Before actions become behavior, they first have to be thoughts. Intention is extremely important in Buddhism, and that's where we're actually having some issues in today's world. Humanity today does not have the luxury, to some degree, of calling themselves the possessors of freedom of choice. We talk about it all the time. At least in this country, we talk about it a lot. How we have a certain inherent right, which we do. However, do we practice it? Do we even acknowledge it? And that's what I'm going to try to address, that issue from that angle, and see how the violence that we've been seeing during this week and the weeks prior kind of fall into place of understanding. Today we have the whole world basically in the palm of our hands. That's it. All you have to do is just access, and you pretty much have access to the whole entire world. Sadly, how many of us actually have access to our mind, our behaviors? Instead of looking at things intrinsically, we've become so adept, such experts at extrinsic phenomena. Looking outside, oh, what's on Facebook? I wonder how many likes I got on that video I posted. I wonder how many likes I got on the picture I posted. Or what's going on the news? I don't want to be left out. These are common things that we all go through. Almost no one is immune to it. But my question to all of us is, are we? How many of us actually exercise our choice of saying no to whatever is coming in from the outside? So many of us get in our cars early in the morning, drive away, and on the way, typically, we turn on the radio. In Los Angeles, a place notorious for talk shows, which have carried themselves into the radio scene, you have so many programs where people are talking. But talking about what? One of my teachers, Ajahn Tejaniya, he says, when you do retreats with him, he, sometimes he has the several days, the first few days where there's no talking. And then when you've developed the awareness to observe how the mind moves from one thing to the next, he'll invite us to go ahead and observe our conversations, listening to the other person. And then so many of us go up to him later on, like during interviews, say, you know what, is it just me, or is it just, it seems that every single word I say comes out of craving. In essence, it's interesting when we look at our thoughts and our words that come out. Is it really urgent? How much of it is? And what is it about? We've become so isolated in our world today. We used to be a communal beings, group of communal beings, societal beings, where everybody was in everybody else's business in a sense. However, during the past few centuries, we've been thinking about individuality, 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 so much so that within a community of people, we've become such isolated islands. The majority of our contact with other human beings is, again, through our phones, through our internet, through our digital communities. Instead of having contact with other people, we have the internet. We have the news. We have TVs, television shows, etc. But where does that leave us right now, facing the situation that's been going on, the environment of violence that's going on in the world today? Science has come up with some interesting discoveries. There's this thing called neuroplasticity. People used to think that the mind is rigid. It doesn't change. After a certain age, you don't change, if at all. But again and again, scientific experiments are showing how the mind is so plastic, so it can change, and it does change given a new set of environments that it finds itself in. It's interesting how we find the same principle mentioned in the first verse of the Dhammapada, where the Buddha 2600 years ago mentions how the mind is the forerunner of all states, of all evil states and then all good states. Mind is chief. Mind-made are they. And if you've ever followed along as to what's going on in the world and what new novel ideas have been promoted by such bright minds, in today's world to promote wellness and health, you come across the principle of law of attraction, for example, which has been talked about again and again and again. When I read about this, I saw the similarities between the Dhammapada's verse, how the mind is the forerunner, meaning that it's the beginning, it's like the first, it's the edge, it's the tip of the arrow that leads one's action into manifestation. And that's why I wanted to mention how the conversation going on between our ears is so important. However, how many of us are truly aware of this? I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, and he was asking me some questions on meditation, and I said, do you know that meditation today is no longer a luxury? Today, meditation is no longer to be considered a luxury. It's a necessity. The environment changes the mind. Once the mind has changed, the personality changes. However, in between the personality and the mind changing, there's several steps that need to take place. What is personality? If you think about it, it's the reality that the person makes, keeps doing. What is a person's reality? A person's personality. Okay, how can we come across a person's reality? How can we see that? In what form does it present itself to us? Through one's behavior. What is behavior? One's consistent set of actions. Okay, what is that coming from? You look at it and you see what a person constantly thinks about. That's what that person becomes in the form of our actions. So we look at what's going on in the world, the movies that come out, and the lack of a communal spirit, the violence that's promoted, the sex that is promoted, you see how we've become segregated to such a point where we no longer are able to process the emotions that we feel as a result of this. And this brings us to the essence of today's talk, which is, how do you deal with heavy-duty emotions? Today's medical professionals, scientists, have come to agree how anger that is unexpressed, frustration that is not explored, turns into chronic pain in the body. You will even look at it in a functional MRI scan. You will see it. And I've been reading a book by a medical professional. He's been around for such a long time. He's healed. Basically, his book has healed so many people with back pain. And his name is Dr. Sarno, S-A-R-N-O. I think he's from the East Coast. And he says how the brain, the mind, he's using, he's a medical professional. He's saying how the mind and the body have become divided in society. Pharmaceutical companies are making such a huge, net profit. Medical professionals the same way. Having people go in and getting surgical procedures done into the spine where it could easily, for most people, this is coming from him, for most people it could actually be resolved through revisiting their thinking patterns. What you think about, that's what we become. So the environment that you live in, if we do not remove ourselves from it, change is not going to take place. Now, there's two types of environments. the environment that is outside of us and the environment that is within us, the inner environment. So someone may come forward and say, you know what, I was born in a very, very nasty, horrible, violent environment. Okay? So I am, to some degree, genetically prone to being violent, right? This has been the case of, people, if you've ever heard of nature versus nurture. And it's an argument that's still been going on for like 40 or 50 years. Depending on which position or which camp of the argument you belong to, people have been going at it. However, it's not necessarily, in my opinion, something that needs to be fought head to head against each other. In fact, it's a complementary phenomena, basically, that needs to be taking place, and that's where the division between body and mind no longer needs to be there. Okay. Where does that leave the violence that has occurred this past week? Police officers being killed, civilians being killed by police officers, and the chain goes on and on and on. We've talked so many times about the three poison: lobha, dosa, moha. Attachment or lust, anger or hatred or aversion, things that we don't like, versus things that we like and love and want to possess. And the third one, which is delusion or ignorance. I call the third one the mother of the two. Where does that leave us with all this aftermath of these acts? It tells me one thing for sure. There's a major lack of education in today's world, specifically in this country. I've worked as an educator, I still do in some respects, for over 15 years. And working with different age groups from kindergarten all the way to adults in university, I can vouch that many of today's US population, at least, is lacking the necessary education to really look at themselves in a very mature way, emotionally mature way. We're lacking decision-making power. I'm talking obviously in general terms, of course exceptions are highly respected. However, and when we're talking about the general population, this is what's happening. There's major funding being taken away from schools, from public schools. There's frustration, there's stress, there's anxiety, which takes us to anger. When anxiety and stress, which you can look at their foundation as being or stemming from loss and hurt. When you have loss and hurt, you have tremendous amount of stress building up. And when that stress, which the Buddha also called suffering or dukkha, is not taken care of, it will take form in the form of anger, because anger is already built up energy. It's like the steam that builds up, and then steamships and trains like that used to use the steam as a propellant, ends up being the force behind a person's violent acts. And when you take into consideration the fact that we've become islands, then it becomes a matter of, you're not understanding me, you don't know what I'm going through, you've never been in the environment that I grew up in, and you're not addressing my concerns, therefore I need to act it out. Well, the civilian who's looking at the police officer, for example, is unaware that Yes, this police officer has a badge, has a gun, has power, therefore. They don't realize that the police officer themselves happen to be going through the same thing. They have anger, they have stress, they have anxieties as well. It's just that they have an advantage of having extra power. And with extra power comes extra responsibility. Now, if both individuals are not tapping into their own mind, in a sense, becoming aware of the value of their thoughts and how important it is for them to sit down and really absorb what's really going on, and giving space to the experience or to the emotions of anger, the feelings of frustration, then they're just bottling it up. And given the situations that we're living in the society, it's just a matter of time until they do blow up. And then we're like, how did that occur? We don't live in a vacuum, folks. We live in reality where conditions dictate what happens. That's what the main message of the Buddha was. Things happen based on conditions, period. Things happen because of conditions. But when we look at it in a very technical or cold or clinical sense, that statement, we might run into some problems when we don't consider the value of how much of a role we do have in changing the conditions. And that's where Buddhism can come in and introduce us back to the freedom of choice. Freedom of choice is not something that someone else gives us. They've done tests and interviews and experiments with prison inmates, where even individuals who had several lifetimes of of jail time given to them, or people who are in solitary confinement, and they ask them how they feel. And some of them even came out and said they feel so free. They feel so calm. There's a state of freedom that they're experiencing. There's a state of joy that they experience. The reporters or the researchers look at each other as like, how's this guy doing it? Because they're in a solitary confinement or incarcerated for the rest of their lives. So that tells us about the attitude that we can bring into our experience of whatever's going on. The attitude that we maintain, start off in the morning actually. And a good exercise for that would be experiencing some sense of gratitude in the morning. Having some sense of, you know what? It feels great to be alive. I can't believe it. I have at least, 16 hours of wakeful time waiting for me. And I can do so much. It's all for me to choose. Yeah, I have to go to work. I have to drive through traffic. I have to do this. I have to meet my boss. I have to deal with my coworkers. And let's say it's the worst situation. Worst traffic, worst boss, worst coworkers, worst kind of a job. Those are extrinsic. I highly recommend that you look for better ones. However, many of us don't have that option. However, you do have your own mind. We do have our own choices in making that day turn out to be an amazing experience. I used to work at a place at an educational facility where I had to go in and pretty much lecture for about 4 or 5 hours every day. And I was fortunate enough to have been introduced to a supervisor who ended up being not the easiest one in the world. So there was tremendous amount of resistance there waiting for me. So initially I would just have this resentment. I was like, you know what, I gotta find another job. I gotta find another place. This is not, but then the love that I had for my students, I was just like, you know what, I'm gonna go with this. Let's see how long this will last. And then I saw how by changing my attitude, I could really change the outcome of my experience of that, or of those 5 hours, or whatever that I was going to spend there. But one of the things that I used to do was basically radiate loving kindness and completely drench the whole building with metta. I would take that whole building and dip it into this huge bucket of metta. Nothing could escape it. Gold-plated with metta. How's that? Before I even got there, by the time I parked the car and walked to the facility, people would be like smiling to me. I, for one, most important experience for me, as far as I was concerned, was how I felt when I was approaching. Was I intimidated? Was I feeling any type of anxiety, stress? And those 5 hours felt like a few minutes. That is living fully wholesome, kusala. Changing other people's lives by changing the environment within. And by doing that, you change the environment outside of us. You know, there's a part of the brain, the frontal lobe or prefrontal cortex, that we human beings have. Actually, other beings have them too. However, ours happens to be the biggest in percentage. Human beings, the prefrontal cortex is about 40% of the whole brain, the volume, size of the brain. 40%. Other, let's say, primates like chimpanzees and monkeys, they have anywhere from 14 to 17% the size of their brain. Dogs have about 4% and cats have about 3.5%. Unfortunately, many of us are not using it. Instead, we fall back into fight or flight tendencies or instincts that comes to us from our reptilian brain, in a sense, which is the oldest part of the brain, the lowest part of the brain. And that makes us reactionary. A person pulls a gun at us, we react and we pull our gun. I came from a country that actually used to happen on a daily basis. We would watch as kids, Western movies, and then the interesting thing was that, cowboys, in the movies, generic, stereotypical cowboy walks around with guns. That was on the screen, on the TV or on the movie screen. However, you would walk out of the movie screen and you go outside the movie theater, people were like that. They had guns. And if anybody looked at anybody else in a mean way, somebody was going to die. And that was a common phenomenon on a daily basis for 17 years at least of my life in Lebanon. That's what I witnessed. Now, you don't have to go to a foreign country. You can go to an inner city like anywhere in the United States where unfortunately these things are still happening. Well, what's the problem? What is causing the problem? We're not using the 40% of our brain mass, prefrontal cortex. Well, how can we use that? Remember I mentioned something about meditation no longer being a luxury? Well, that's where this comes in. When we meditate, our prefrontal cortex start lighting up. It's amazing. There's a sense of joy that comes in. It's similar to the way that an artist or anybody who's being creative feels, where time and space just seem to stop. That sense of joy reaffirms to us that we're doing something right. By sitting there meditating, you are changing the neuroplasticity of the brain, if you remember from the beginning of the talk. Now, Some students have come to me and said, well, you know what, I don't have the time to meditate. I was at a coffee shop yesterday, and the barista, he turned to me and he's like, you know what, once I finish school this semester, that's when I'm going to start meditating. And I said, wow, at least you're not telling me once I get married or once I travel somewhere, well, you know, summer semester, it's going to be over within a few weeks. Obviously, I was joking with him, and he got what I was trying to say. And I said, you really don't need to be a monk. You really don't need to be even a Buddhist. You don't need to be anything. You can just sit there, or stand, or lay down, or walk. Those are the 4 positions that the Buddha talked about, that give us the opportunity to just, you know, explore. Hello, Bhante Subhuti. I haven't seen you for so many years.
Okay.
Sadhu. All 3 of us used to actually study across the street with Bhante Ratnasara. So I haven't seen Bhante for over 20 years, in fact. So wonderful to see you again. We don't consider the fact that we do not necessarily need to be meditating, in a sense, like the official, you know, formal way of sitting there for 30 minutes or 45 minutes at one sitting. What is the most amount of preoccupation that we have on a daily basis? Everyone's different. Can we bring sense of awareness into that experience? Even if it's for a few minutes, even if it's for a few seconds at a time. Those few seconds are like those tiny little drops that will fill up the bucket. However, we have a tendency of giving up so fast. See, in our society here, we have this, especially the American society, we have this drive of attaining our goals yesterday. And we usually come up with lofty goals. I want to drop my body fat percentage to single digits. Or I want to drop 125 pounds by next week. I'm exaggerating, of course. Hopefully you're not thinking that. But most people think very close to those, those lines. And, once I get this, I will be happy. Once I have that 5-bedroom house overlooking the ocean in Malibu, that's when I'm going to be happy. So we're very goal-oriented, but we rehearse a negative way of thinking. Remember the connection between thought and action, which makes up the personality or the person's reality? That's where I'm coming to. Whenever we are goal-oriented in that sense and forget about this thing called the journey, there's this old adage of, it's not about the goal, it's about the journey. We keep hearing about it, reading about it, see it in movies. But how many of us can actually pause and look at that in real time? See, I love to cook and make food. So, especially when I'm hungry, I'm just thinking about munching through the food, the bowl. I want to eat that salad. And I'm already thinking about, delicious organic green tomatoes, lettuce, romaine lettuce, cucumbers, some mozzarella, maybe some meat grilled if, I eat chicken and things. And so I'm thinking about that, avocado, olive oil, some garlic, some lemon. I was like, okay, that's the goal. But meanwhile, my fingers are working, my hands are working to wash the lettuce, to wash the cucumber, to chop them up, etc. I'm completely forgetting the role that I'm playing right now in preparing the salad, which eventually will be my food. So my invitation to you is, how can we bring back the awareness to whatever it is that I'm doing right now, that we're doing right now, the preparation of that? Can I chop those onions or the tomatoes with some joy, with some love, with awareness? Because you cannot be aware when you're loving. You cannot be creative without feeling joy. You can't be joyful without having some awareness. They all work together. So, how can I actually bridge that with the act of violence that's going on in the world today, all around the world, in fact? In order for violence to take place, there needs to be a lack of awareness to a point where there's none. So we become simply absent-minded, simply oblivious of the real time, our lives. And we become reactionary, completely slaves to whatever the other person does or says to us. And it doesn't need to be so. That's where we can actually exercise our freedom of choice. Not being dependent on the actions of someone else. If somebody spits on my face, that's their action. If somebody looks at me in a mean way, that's their action, their choice. But my choice dictates that I respond in a way that I find it suitable for me to still maintain my state of joy. So I know my time's up, and this is, as I said, it's a very interesting topic, and I'm going to be available after the chanting, where we can. Please feel free to ask questions. Bhante, do we have time for one question or no?
Only one question, right?
One question. I guess we'll leave it after. I guess.
Yeah.
All right.
We can do
Thank you for listening.